San Francisco's Board of Supervisors unanimously accepting a draft reparations plan that includes a one-time $5 million payment to each eligible Black resident, following a more than 5-hour spirited hearing where supporters explained what the plan would mean to the community.
I'm not a victim, and I'm not looking for a handout, but I have been harmed by the structural and institutional racism that exists here.
If you take care of the Black community is going to take care of all of us. My dad always taught me never to beg. And I'm not begging you today, but I am telling you, when my parents migrated here from Louisiana to San Francisco, it was for a hope and a dream that they would be treated fairly.
The Reparations Committee will submit its final proposal in June ahead of the board's next hearing in September. Let's bring in Cheryl Davis, Executive Director of the Human Rights Commission, also San Francisco Republican Party Chairman John Dennis. Glad to have you both here. You can imagine that people are really honing in, of course, on the figure, the $5 million figure, and what this ultimately looks like. And I want to begin right there because the eligibility criteria has a lot of tongues wagging as to how you would know who would be eligible. But let's first begin with that number. How would you be able to really finance it? That's the number one question people have in their brain.
I would say that that is an ongoing question and process. When we look at Evanston, they started the process and they weren't able to fulfill that amount to all of the folks who were eligible, but they started the process. So that's one piece of it. The second is we've been doing a lot to explore and consider public-private partnerships. And so that's another piece, that it's not just about the burden being given to the city and county of San Francisco, but what does it look like for us to explore what it looks like for folks who gained and made wealth, the banks, the insurance companies, on slavery. And so that's another piece that we've been looking at. So it's not solely isolated to the city and county of San Francisco or saying everybody's going to be paid out at the same time.
But there was a hearing just yesterday, and John, you were there at last night's hearing. And in fact, you tweeted, quote, "It was pure theater, a comedy tonight." Tell me what you mean and why.
It just reminded me, I did a play in high school called "The Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum," and that was one of the lines, "comedy tonight." That's what it was. And it was really, frankly, shameful. I mean, every supervisor who sat in that chamber last night knows damn well that no one is going to get paid that money. Because, first of all, the ones who have political ambition, career ambitions, their careers will end the second they vote yes for that. For the ones who don't care, who are so detached from reality that they couldn't have a political career, they could go ahead and vote for it, but the courts are going to strike it down. I know firsthand, I've been asked to participate in a lawsuit to challenge this, and it's just not going to pass. So to go through the exercise last night, to invite people for hours to request this money, knowing damn well they're never going to see it, is just another example of Democrats failing the Black community in San Francisco. If I can make this point, when the last Republican was elected to San Francisco city government in the early 1970s, the Democrats have had hegemonic control over the city government, and the Black community has been driven out. There's been a war on Black people by the Democrat Party, driving them out of San Francisco. They were 14% when the Democrats took over. Today they are at 5%. That is what this is all about. It's a massive distraction regarding the failures of the Democrat Party when it comes to the African-American community.
Well, see, John, I think some of the data, though, here, many people thought the idea of the decline in Black population in some place like San Francisco was directly related to the inability to ever afford any housing in the area, given all the things that are going on there. Not that every Black person living in the city has economic constraints, but how do you see it, Cheryl? I want to get Cheryl into this and respond. Do you see this as performative, as he is alluding, and that this is somehow an indication that this was theatrics just to demonstrate something about the Democratic Party?
Well, I would say off top, it's offensive to imply that it was theatric and just for show, especially for the people who stood in line for hours to speak. It's one thing to make that comment specifically about the Board of Supervisors, but it's another to put it out there just broadly Folks came there, they put their hearts, their souls, and their history on the line. And for them, it was not performative. It was about the city being able to listen and hear why people think it's important. I think that that language is part of why, not just the financial piece, but why people are so upset. Black people specifically, they feel invisible, they feel like they are labeled and that they are generalized and that they are not welcome in San Francisco, and that continues to happen and it is perpetuated. That it has not happened just in language, but in deed, that all throughout the ages, we have seen the policies, we have seen the people in power, and we have seen the systems be set up to make sure that Black people can't buy, and that when they do buy homes, they were taken from them for a percentage or sometimes not for anything that they were worth. So I think the challenge here is, how do we make sure that we own and acknowledge that wrong has been done, and that when Black people come out, it is not minimalized and focused on the Board of Supervisors, but that we actually listen to what the folks said when they stepped up to the podium.
What's your response to that?
If I can respond to that, I mean, well, first of all, I sat in the audience and was touched and moved by much of the testimony. And in fact, I've been on other media for several months now talking about we should have this conversation. I'm all for it. But so my comments were not directed at the people who were making public comment last night. No, far from it. The theater was directed by the Democrats who control the San Francisco Board of Supervisors. Again, they know well that having those folks stand in line and give their impassioned pleas to get this, these reparations will never materialize. And it's another failure, again, of the Democrats, to drag the Black community through this exercise. Think about, by the way, there's not which Republican in City Hall you're going to blame this on when the folks who came and testified last night and gave their comment don't receive that money. There's no Republican involved in this.
But John, let me ask you, why do you feel, and this is probably to the point that Cheryl has said, why do you feel that the opportunity for people to be heard in a democratic system where we have a government of, for, and by the people, why is that notice and opportunity to be heard, essentially a kind of intellectual due process happening? Why do you think that was somehow divisive and an ability to try to humiliate?
No, there was a thing of beauty about it. I loved listening to it. That wasn't the issue. I just think that the Board of Supervisors commissioned this report, which was terribly unserious. I think I was the first person to say it was, and then it was confirmed in a Washington Post article that many other people felt that it was a very unserious attempt. And then to actually have that exercise built upon the foundation of a grossly unserious commission report was just, it was just theater for the supervisors. Hope they were amused. But it was a terrible thing to put those folks who waited in the line to make their comment, a terrible thing to put them through. And again, it's just another example of, the Democrat Party's attack on the Black community. Keep in mind, by the way, another failure of the Democrat Party, we have a terrible homeless problem here in San Francisco, wildly disproportionately represented by the Black community. Another failure of the Democrat Party. It really is time for the Black community to challenge the Democrat Party and question whether or not they belong in that party. The Black community is warmly and welcome, and we'd be excited to have them in the Republican Party.
Well, all right, everyone, you just heard about San Francisco's move now to consider reparations payments for eligible Black residents. Atlantic senior editor Van Newkirk is here to weigh in, along with John Hart, Karen Finney, and Elliot Williams. Let me begin with you over here, Van. I'm glad to have you here on the show. What's your reaction to the viewpoint that one of the guests espoused, which is, look, this is the Democrat, he said, Democratic Party that is attempting to essentially maybe humiliate Black voters and Black residents into believing that reparations is possible. I'm paraphrasing naturally.
Well, he was focusing on feasibility, right? And I think if you make any honest accounting of what's happened to Black folks in this country and try to repair it, you're going to come up against the limits of feasibility, right? You're talking about, in San Francisco alone, billions of dollars that we have to account for. You're talking about the country, trillions. And how do you put that all in one go and pay for it? So I think he's right that there is going to be a conversation about how do we actually pay for it? Is it actually realistic? But honestly, if you want to do it all at once right now, you're going to have to change what you believe is realistic or not. So it's not, I think, an attempt to just curry favor. You've got to do a thing that nobody's done before, and that's going to be hard. It might be unrealistic.
Well, thinking about the money, and obviously the focus, when you say a $5 million headline, people lean in, they've got immediate opinions on the issue. But there are also kind of the non-monetary things that can be done as well. And I will point out, if you read the full thing, they are pointing out other aspects in terms of housing insecurity, other things in terms of income disparities and the wealth gap. But the idea that it's just focused on that 5 million, does it miss the mark to only focus there?
Absolutely. I mean, the point is to acknowledge that there was a wrong done, that was systemic, that is historic, that continues to this day. But when you hear the 5 million, I do agree that it just sounds so ridiculous. That does seem almost offensive to the idea that we need to have a serious conversation. I think it was probably very important for people, and cathartic, frankly, to be able to be heard in a venue like that, because lots of us got a lot of feeling about how all this has gone down. But that being said, from a political aspect, I would think you would want to, as elected officials, be able to come back to some of the other things that are part of this report and say, what are the things that we can do, that we can realistically, feasibly do, that could make a difference, that will acknowledge the wrong? And
she did mention, and again, this commission is comprised of community stakeholders. They are not, it's not binding, obviously. There was the vote to actually move it right along in intermediary fashion. But she mentioned the idea of maybe having it financed in a public and private partnerships. The idea of, and this is in a week we're talking about banks collapsing in the area as well. That's not lost on me. But the idea that there could be corporate contributions in some way. What do you say to that?
Well, I still think it's an unworkable concept. I think it's unwise, unjust, and unworkable, because you're really asking future generations to pay for mistakes that past generations made. And the conversation about race needs more light than heat. And I think what San Francisco is doing is bringing more heat than light. And I think the light is going back to the American idea that our rights don't come from the state, they don't come from our race or gender or geography. They come from natural law or nature's God. And Frederick Douglass described the Constitution as a glorious liberty document, that if we could properly interpret that and properly bring it to being, that's the way to do it. So, there needs to be not a government top-down reparations plan. There needs to be a national conversation about race where communities do come together and have this dialogue, where people can be heard and express their views. And that's the way to do it.
Excuse me, I'm going to cut you off. Conceptually, though, Elliot, we do ask future generations all the time to pay for what's going on in the past. I mean, climate change, but one example, perhaps, or the ideas of how paying for, different social safety net programs, in a sense. We do, as a society, agree that at times it's appropriate.
Well, not even that. It's how do you decide when the problem ended, right? So certainly, this whole idea of making people in the past pay for something that happened in the future. Okay, so was it the day after slavery? Once slavery ended, did all of the problems go away? Okay, maybe 10 years after slavery, 50, and so on. I think we can all stipulate that there are racial imbalances and issues in this nation that had their roots back in the 1860s and even before. I don't think that's up for debate. Now, I think where we're all in agreement is that the solution's not workable. And just even look at some of the, so for instance, a mixed race person in San Francisco, someone who has one black and one white, do they get $2.5 million? Or someone like me who's black, but whose parents are immigrants from another country, but still might fear when I'm stopped by a police officer, do I get $1 million? I don't know. I mean, how does it, so it's just, all of this is fraught with problems, but I think it's a little bit, I think I'm just not persuaded by the idea that merely because we are 150 or 200 years or however many years removed from the end of slavery, that somehow everything's fine in the United States. And I just don't think that's.
But the conversation, we need to have a conversation about identity politics, okay? And it isn't just a left problem. So the right always focuses on woke politics, race, gender, et cetera. But on the right, there's this idea that your rights come from your geography. And that's as equally anti-American, because if our rights come from our place or our gender, we've diminished the Constitution. And the reality is there's no number of pronouns or symbols or letters that you could attach to a person to capture their dignity. And that's a beautiful idea that we have in America. And that's what we need to grab hold of on the left and right.
Well, fortunately, in this country, gender is not indicative of any of the rights you may or may not ever have again.